Hi everyone, thanks for listening to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, the Norwegians woke up and realized that the King of Denmark had been forced to hand them over to Sweden. Even though many Norwegians were happy not to be governed from Copenhagen anymore, they weren't interested in Stockholm taking over. Instead, they wanted independence for Norway. So they called elections for a constitutional assembly that would meet and put together a constitution for an independent Norway, something that the world hadn't seen since 1397. That's when the Kalmar Union was established. Remember the Kalmar Union? That was way back in episode 58. Anyway, they didn't have much time since they worried that the Swedes might use military power to enforce the Treaty of Kiel, where the Danish king had given Norway to Sweden. That meant that the most remote parts of Norway didn't have time to hold elections and send representatives, but in April 1814, 112 elected representatives gathered at Eidsvoll, just north of the capital Christiania, to try and put together a constitution before the Swedes would show up. Today, we'll see how they managed. Episode 125, Norway Resurrected. The assembly members who gathered at Eidsvoll were well aware that more than 400 years ago, Norway had been an independent country, ruled by its own king and governed by its own laws. They were now a part of the process of reawakening that ancient Norway. You can imagine how giddy with excitement they must have been. They met for the first time on Easter Sunday, the holiday of hope and rebirth. The symbolism of them resurrecting Norway was lost on exactly no one. The enthusiasm for the project was great, not only at home, but also in Denmark. In Copenhagen, people donned green bows in their hats, and a Norwegian society was founded for patriotic Norwegians and their Danish supporters. But King Frederick VI, who worried that the great powers would think that he was behind it in a bid to reverse the Treaty of Kiel, and who feared that the Norwegian constitution would bring dangerous political ideas to Denmark, actually banned the society. The work on the new Norwegian constitution would take place at the manor house at Eidsvoll, and even though it's a sizable property, it couldn't accommodate all 112 members of the assembly. Not all of them could stay at the big house, so some were given lodgings in the vicinity. Not all accommodations were up to the same standard, and a few assembly members complained about their rooms and the food. Some members were also housed so far away that local farmers had to shuttle them back and forth to the big house for the deliberations. The assembly members came from various walks of life. 22 of them were farmers, others were merchants, officers or soldiers, but the majority of them were civil servants, filling various functions in the Norwegian administration, lawyers, academics, and priests, for example. Most assembly members were familiar with and influenced by the Enlightenment thinkers and wanted a constitution in that enlightened spirit. They believed that everyone was born with certain rights that the government mustn't violate. This was new. They also thought that the authority to govern a country should stem from the people, not God. This too was new, just barely implemented in the US and France so far. One of the assembly members who championed these ideas was Professor Georg Sverdrup. It was he who had convinced Christian Frederick that he needed to relinquish his right to the Norwegian throne and instead let the Norwegian people elect him king. Another was the theologian Nikolai Wergeland, who was well versed in the constitutions of other countries and who was a big fan of democratic government. Needless to say, all these ideas were forbidden in Denmark, governed by an absolute monarch whose unchallenged authority was supposed to stem from God. But government accountability and liberal rights weren't the only things on the assembly members' wish list. For example, the farmers in the assembly also had more down-to-earth concerns, such as general conscription instead of the farmers sending their sons to become cannon fodder in various wars. They also wanted to strengthen land rights for farmers and protect the economic life of the farming community. For instance, they wanted to limit the sale of agricultural land and ban city dwellers from owning mills or businesses in the countryside. This was obviously at odds with the intentions of others, both those who preferred a professional army and those who were against economic regulations and monopolies. It would lead to debates during the assembly sessions, but they would be far from the most heated debates. The members of the assembly met for the first time outside Eidsvoll Church that Easter Sunday, April 10th, where the regent, Christian Frederick, greeted them. The following day, April 11th, started with lunch. The posher assembly members were treated to a lunch at the big house. Then everyone, no matter where they'd been eating, met at the great hall for the solemn roll call. Everyone was dressed in their Sunday best or dress uniforms, crammed in on hard, narrow benches with no back support. Basically, it was even worse than a low-cost airline in terms of personal space. Christian Frederick was pale and emotional. He'd clearly been crying. He delivered a stirring speech about the importance of the task at hand and also told the assembly members that he had written to all the crowned heads of Europe who he hoped would support Norway's noble cause. But he failed to mention that he didn't expect any of the great powers to actually support Norwegian independence. Even worse, he kept from the assembly that he was receiving troubling news about the Swedes preparing an invasion. Christian Frederick worried that if the 112 men at Eidsvoll had known the full picture of their precarious situation, they might lose heart and perhaps abandon the project. And his only hope of attaining the Norwegian crown was for the assembly to write a constitution and elect him king. The following day, April 12th, the real work began. The debates at Eidsvoll were carried out behind closed doors. No journalists were allowed, and no detailed protocols were kept. We only know what was said, and sometimes shouted, via incomplete private recollections, such as diaries and letters. But we do know what the assembly decided. To begin with, a constitutional committee of 15 members was set up to put together a draft constitution, and then the whole assembly would debate that draft. Then the committee would come up with the final text based on the decisions of the assembly. Among the leading members of the committee were its president, Christian Magnus Falsen, and Count Herman Wedel Jarlsberg. They represented two conflicting perspectives within the assembly. Falsen wanted a conservative constitution, with as much power as possible vested in the king. He also argued for a weak parliament, with an upper house that could curb various radical ideas. Furthermore, Falsen wanted the king to be able to veto parliamentary decisions and keep the elected representatives of the people away from sensitive topics such as foreign policy. That, he thought, should be the king's exclusive prerogative. Falsen was in constant connection with the regent to get his feedback and to incorporate as many of his ideas as possible in the constitution. He's even been called Christian Frederick's instrument in the assembly. At the same time, Falsen also looked out for the interests of the peasant population. He wanted to protect the agricultural sector, which he thought was the backbone of Norway's economy, and that meant protecting the farmers by getting rid of merchant privileges and monopolies and to spread the burden of war more evenly. He felt that the merchants had exploited the wartime situation to force farmers to sell land and farms for pennies on the dollar. Count Wedel Jarlsberg, on the other hand, wanted a liberal constitution, breaking from absolutism. He wanted a document that guaranteed freedoms, rights, and accountable governance. In practice, that meant that he wanted a strong parliament and government and a weaker king. He didn't altogether trust Christian Frederick and suspected that the regent was keeping important information from its members. More on that later. No fewer than 20 suggested drafts for a constitution had been submitted to the assembly. Falsen and Nikolai Wergeland, a liberal priest, had brought the most thorough ones. Having something to start with helped to speed up the process, and speed was of the essence, since nobody knew when the Swedes might come knocking. The committee soon decided that the most efficient way to proceed would be to present the assembly with a short list of basic principles to approve. Then the committee would be able to base the draft constitution on those principles. So, on April 14th, the Constitutional Committee presented 11 principles for the assembly to debate. These principles covered the basics of any Enlightenment-era constitution, such as freedom of the press, freedom of religion, limited government, checks and balances, etc., etc. The assembly was given 48 hours to mull over these basic principles, and on April 16th, they were debated in a plenary session. Many of the members who attended described it as a tumultuous day at Eidsvoll. It would turn out to be the first day of clashes between the two emerging parties in the Constitutional Assembly. So, what were these parties? The first one, known as the Union Party, or the Negotiation Party, was led by Count Herman Wedel Jarlsberg. They wanted an independent Norway, sure, but they were realistic enough to realize that the country wasn't going to win a war against Sweden. So, if the Swedes were to insist on implementing the Treaty of Kiel, the best thing for Norway would be to negotiate a deal where the Norwegians would have as much internal autonomy as possible within the union with Sweden. For obvious reasons, their opponents like to call them the Swedish Party. The second party was the Independence Party. They strived for a Norwegian kingdom independent from both Denmark and Sweden. They wanted to wrap up the work with the constitution as soon as possible and to elect Christian Frederick, King of Norway, to create facts on the ground. They hoped that this would make the great powers hesitate to support the Swedish demands for a union. Their opponents pointed out that Christian Frederick was also next in line to the Danish throne, which meant that sooner or later he'd be King of Denmark as well, thereby automatically re-establishing the union with Denmark. And what would happen then with the new Norwegian constitution? Would he let them keep it, or would he reinforce Danish-style absolutism in Norway? Because of these risks, they called the Independence Party the Danish Party, pointing out that their version of Norwegian independence was not only a pipe dream, but also an illusion. The Union Party was backed by a handful of intellectuals and most merchants who wanted peace and stability, which was good for business. But the Independence Party had the support of most of the civil servants and the farmers, two groups that were loyal to Christian Frederick personally and the dynasty he belonged to. That meant that the Independence Party basically had an automatic majority in the assembly, with approximately 80 of the 112 delegates. The two sides clashed immediately when the first basic principle came up for debate. Falsen, who led the Independence Party, suggested that the constitution should state that Norway should be a free, independent, and indivisible kingdom. This sparked a fierce debate because members of the Union Party felt it was basically a trick, ruling out the possibility of a union with Sweden, and forcing the assembly down the road toward the all but automatic election of Christian Frederick as king. Wergeland stood up to speak against Falsen, but he was so long-winding that the other assembly members grew restless and started to shout, "Get to the point!" The chairman of the session, who was sympathetic to his position, tried to let Wergeland speak, but after he'd been going on for another half hour, even the chairman had to ask him to hand in the speech in writing instead. Unfortunately, Wergeland didn't learn anything from this episode, and this wasn't the last time he gave a speech that was far too long. He soon got the reputation of being a pest, and the bad will he brought upon himself also spread to the Union Party that he represented. Falsen's suggestion carried the day, gaining 75 votes. That meant that the Norwegian constitution would also be a sort of declaration of independence. Regarding the decision that the head of state should be king, there was very little opposition, especially the farmers felt strongly about this point. But some assembly members worried about the expense. Norway was a poor country back then. How would it be able to afford a royal court? After this debate, the assembly member Severin Löwenskiold wrote in his diary, "May God provide my poor fatherland with the means to support a king." Members of the Union Party who suspected Christian Frederick was hiding things from them regarding international developments then motioned for a Foreign Affairs Committee to be set up at Eidsvoll. They argued that the regent was obligated to share all he knew about Norway's foreign relations with the assembly. Their aim was to stop Christian Frederick from handling foreign policy on his own without parliamentary oversight. In the long term, they hoped that it would be easier to give Parliament influence over foreign policy if there was a Foreign Affairs Committee already at Eidsvoll. In the short term, they wanted to figure out whether the great powers intended to back up Sweden in case Bernadotte decided to invade. As I've already mentioned, in that eventuality, the Union Party felt the only realistic option would be to agree to a voluntary union with Sweden and try to rescue as much autonomy as possible for Norway within that union. Christian Frederick was obviously against any such deal. If Norway joined Sweden in a union, He wouldn't be king of it, so therefore he wanted an all-or-nothing situation. That required that the 112 were kept away from any worrying news from abroad. Falsen, Christian Frederick's ally in the assembly, argued against the suggestion to set up a foreign affairs committee. He said you couldn't have foreign diplomats talking to assembly members. Some, who weren't that well versed in foreign policy or politics in general, could be duped by spies and foreign agents. He also objected to the idea of a foreign affairs committee in principle, because that went beyond the mandate of the assembly. It was elected to put together a constitution, nothing else. Count Wedel Jarlsberg from the Union Party argued that that was an illegitimate curbing of the sovereignty of the people, whose representatives they were. They had the right to discuss and decide anything as representatives of the people. The debate was fierce, but in the end no decision was made. The motion was tabled until after the weekend. During those days, people kept talking and debating, and the divide between the two camps grew wider and deeper. It developed into a situation where those who felt the assembly needed to have access to the full picture were accused of being traitors, because they were also open to a union with Sweden. So the self-proclaimed patriots chose to be kept in the dark. Based on the previous week's discussions, the Constitutional Committee started to write the first full draft of the Constitution on April 20th. The following day, Nikolai Wergeland suggested that the Norwegian Parliament should be known as the Storting, or the Great Thing. The name was based on Old Norse literature, and the other members of the committee thought it was a splendid idea. 2/3 of the delegates to the Storting would be elected by the rural population, and city dwellers would be allowed to elect the remaining third. Even though that meant that the rural population would be in the majority, the 10% of Norwegians who lived in towns and cities would still be overrepresented. It took the committee 10 days to finish their first draft. It was presented to the assembly members, who then got 3 days to think about it, and on May 4th, the assembly convened to start debating the final wording of the constitution. The process was progressing at breakneck speed, but at least Wergeland still thought it was all taking too long. He noted in his diary that the 112 members of the assembly were starting to get sick of the sour wine and veal steak that they were fed every evening. The first paragraph, stating that the Kingdom of Norway should be a free, independent, and indivisible realm, was accepted without debate. But they ran into disagreements already at the second paragraph, dealing with freedom of religion. It guaranteed the freedom to practice your religion freely without fear of persecution, as long as you were a Christian. Jews were to be barred entry to Norway. The suggestion was met with protests, not least from a number of priests who objected to this form of discrimination on the grounds that it was intolerant and inhumane. Those who were in favor of the ban argued that Jews were known to be rebellious and treacherous, and that they tricked non-Jews and would never be integrated. So, to protect national security, Jews should be kept out of the country. In the end, the ban on Jews was approved and inscribed into the constitution. In this regard, Norway moved in the opposite direction from autocratic Denmark, where Jews, by a sheer coincidence, had been given full civil rights just a few days before. The religious intolerance among the assembly members wasn't exclusively fed by anti-Semitism, though. Also, Jesuits and monastic orders were banned because they too were seen as a conspiratorial threat to Protestant Norway. But apart from that, Norwegians would enjoy freedom of religion. You had the right to practice any kind of Protestantism that you liked. In addition, a 77-vote majority voted to insert a provision stating that the king must always have been a Protestant. That was obviously directed at Carl Johan Bernadotte, who was a member of the Swedish state church now, but who had been born a Catholic and only converted 4 years earlier when he was elected Crown Prince of Sweden in episode 123. Then, a bunch of paragraphs were adopted without debate. They were about the coronation taking place in Trondheim, the king being commander-in-chief, and forbidding the use of the military against Norwegian citizens. The following day, May 5th, the assembly members got into another debate, this time about Norway's relations with Denmark. The Union Party wanted to make sure that the union with Denmark would never be re-established, even when Christian Frederick ascended the Danish throne. Several of the members of the Independence Party actually shared this view, and they supported the idea to add language to the constitution forbidding a future union between Norway and Denmark. Or, as the priest Nikolai Wergeland put it when he wanted to be funny, what God had separated, let no man join together. As witty as that was, the suggestion met with fierce opposition, especially from civil servants. Culturally, many of them were close to Denmark. They'd studied at Danish universities, and some were even born in Denmark. They managed to torpedo any explicit ban on any future union with Denmark, but the assembly did decide that the king would only be allowed to leave Norway for shorter periods of time, hoping they'd be able to avoid a future situation where Norway would be ruled remotely from Copenhagen. Next on the agenda was the aristocracy. The assembly quickly agreed to ban any new noble titles, but what were they to do with the existing aristocrats? Should they be allowed to keep their titles and privileges? As I've noted before, the nobility in Norway was small and much weaker than in Denmark and Sweden, but it did exist. Even a handful of the 112 assembly members had noble titles. Those arguing in favor of abolishing the nobility altogether argued that it was an important principle of equality. No one should enjoy special rights and privileges thanks to the accident of birth. They found it particularly annoying that the king had taken up the habit of selling titles for large sums of money to cover his expenses, instead of just rewarding those who'd done something extraordinary in the service of the crown. During the debate, Christian Magnus Falsen stood up and renounced his own title. Clearly, he was inspired by the aristocrats at the French National Convention, who on August 4th, 1789, had renounced their noble titles en masse. Explaining his dramatic gesture, Falsen said it cost him nothing and was a logical step based on his principles. Then he urged others to follow his example. But what followed was just embarrassed silence. None of the other aristos followed suit. In the end, it was decided that the first Storting that met would decide the future of the existing Norwegian nobility. Another debate sparked by the looming shadow of Denmark was the question of who should be eligible for public office. Would you have to be born in Norway to be elected to the Storting, to hold office in the state, to work at a Norwegian hospital, or would foreigners who had lived for a long time in Norway and felt Norwegian be eligible as well? It was an important question, not only as a principle, but practically as well. For centuries, Norway had more or less been run by Danes. Could Norway really attain independence if Danes were allowed to continue to work in the civil service? This was a sensitive topic that touched several of the assembly members personally. The original suggestion was that only people born in Norway would be allowed to hold any kind of office, except physicians, teachers, including university professors, and consuls abroad, at least as long as there weren't any suitable Norwegians to fill the posts. It led to heated debate. In the end, it was decided that you had to have lived in Norway for 10 years or be naturalized by an act of the Storting. The next topic up for discussion was voting rights. The assembly decided that Norway should have universal suffrage for citizens 25 years or older, except for women, of course, and servants, and the unemployed, and sailors, and those who didn't own property. In the original draft, farmers needed to own a minimum amount of land to be allowed to vote, meaning that approximately 1/3 of Norwegian farmers wouldn't have the right to vote. But then a farmer called Theis Lundegård argued that the man farming a large plot of land doesn't need more wisdom than one farming a small plot, and in the end, it's the man, not the land, who will speak at the thing. That swayed the assembly, and anyone who owned his own farm got the right to vote. In the end, suffrage was extended to approximately 30 to 40% of Norwegian men over 25. That was perhaps 10% of the total population. Today, it's easy to be critical about that, finding it ridiculously low, especially given the fact that women were completely excluded. But for its time, it was extraordinary. The highest proportion in the world, in fact. Even the revolutionary French Constitution of 1791 only granted the right to vote to about 1% of the French population. Then the assembly moved on to the question of freedom of the press. As I mentioned last time, censorship had increased in the last years of the 18th century. From 1799 onwards, no new text longer than 380 pages could be published unless the police had approved it in advance. Fines and prison time was mandated for those who voiced political criticism. Criticizing the king became a capital offense. From October 1810, you needed a royal warrant to publish anything political, and publishing anything defeatist or even commenting on current affairs in a sarcastic tone also became illegal. This stifling of public discourse was deeply unpopular, so the Assembly voted in favor of freedom of the press without debate. They also approved a number of principles protecting the citizens from abuse by the authorities. No one should be punished for something that wasn't illegal or without a legal sentence. No law should be applied before it was made publicly known, and torture was banned. The last heated debate in the Assembly was about conscription. Should Norway have a general conscription or a professional army? Some, not least the officers in the Assembly, argued for conscription. Also some farmers favored this solution. They argued that it was fairer if everyone did their bit. Colonel Dietrich Hegerman was a strong supporter of general conscription. To make sure that everyone would be able to defend the country, he wanted all boys to start compulsory physical training, including skiing, at the age of 13. He suggested that boys should exercise shooting and skiing after church on Sundays. Those opposing conscription argued that it violated the ideal of freedom of the citizen if they were forced to become soldiers, and secondly, a professional army could do a better job than amateur soldiers. The leading members of the Union Party, Löwenskiöld, Wedel Jarlsberg and Wergeland, all argued against conscription. In the end, the Assembly voted in favor, but allowed for key functionaries to be excluded, such as senior civil servants. In practice, though, it would take many years until conscription was implemented in Norway. It only happened in 1897. In the middle of the debates of the final draft, on May 6th, a day with miserable weather, pouring rain, a completely soaked messenger reached Eidsvoll. He carried a letter from King Frederick VI of Denmark, once again urging the Norwegians to accept a union with Sweden and to let the Swedes take over Norwegian fortresses without a fight. In addition, the messenger could relate that the British were preparing to resume the blockade of Norwegian ports if the Norwegians didn't comply with the Treaty of Kiel. Finally, the news that Christian Frederick had tried to keep from the Assembly had reached Eidsvoll. Soon thereafter, Christian Frederick himself returned from a visit to Christiania and had to admit that Napoleon had been toppled the previous month, but that Bernadotte was still Crown Prince of Sweden. This surprised some Assembly members who had convinced themselves that he wouldn't be able to remain in his position if Napoleon fell. Obviously, all of this upset the 112 Assembly members, but it didn't necessarily make people change their minds. At a lunch soon afterwards, Löwenskiöld, who favored a negotiated settlement with Sweden, got into an argument with another member of the Assembly who accused him of treason. It even came to blows before the two combatants were separated. If anything, the bad news made the Assembly members focus more on their work, trying to complete the constitution as soon as possible, since a Swedish invasion now seemed all but inevitable. On May 11th, the Assembly had finished debating the draft. 3 members of the Constitutional Committee withdrew to polish the text ahead of the final approval, but the substance of the text was basically decided. The Norwegian constitution broke dramatically with Danish absolutism, and the system with an all-powerful king by the grace of God was replaced by the idea of the sovereignty of the people. The document was inspired by the American and the French revolutionary constitutions and Enlightenment thinkers, not least Montesquieu, and it was one of the most democratic and liberal constitutions of its time. But it was not a revolutionary document. The civil servants still governed Norway, just like they had done during the Danish absolutism. The Assembly explicitly decided that the old laws should be in place until a new law code had been passed by the Storting. So in practice, nothing much changed. It also reflected political realities in Norway 1814. What I mean is that the proponents of Enlightenment ideals, such as Löwenskiöld and Wedel Jarlsberg, wanted a strong parliament with permanent subcommittees dealing with financial and foreign policy. This would act as a counterweight against the power of the king. And even though many other Assembly members shared their ideals in theory, they thought that Norway needed a strong king as a guarantee against the threat of a forced union with Sweden. The result was a mix of ideals and reality, resulting in an executive power in the form of the king that was much stronger than what many of the assembly members had wanted in principle. For some of the assembly members, this, and the aggressive way the debates in the assembly had been conducted, left a bad taste in their mouth. On sensitive issues, especially regarding foreign policy and the relations to Sweden, assembly members who had expressed minority views had been attacked, accused of treason, ridiculed, and threatened. Jakob Aall wrote to his wife that anyone expressing an opposing view was under attack, and if that spirit would continue, he would take her and the children and move to Denmark. He looked forward to the business at Eidsvoll wrapping up so he could escape this hell as soon as possible. The final version of the constitution was presented to the assembly on May 16th, and the following day, May 17th, it was declared to be complete. 2 copies were dated, signed and sealed by the chairmanship of the session. One of the copies would be handed over to the king they were about to elect, and the second copy was to be signed by all the assembly members. The assembly also decided to send a letter to the King of Sweden, declaring that they would defend their freedom with their life and blood. But they also offered an alliance and pact of friendship to try to avoid a war. Falsen declared that now the sacred fire of liberty burned in the chest of every Norwegian, and our name will be great in the annals of history, and other such things that were fitting for the occasion, but may seem a little much to modern ears. Then, still May 17th, they went on to elect a king. A minority of assembly members made one last-ditch attempt to postpone the election until after the conflict with Sweden had been settled. But they were met with such strong protests from the leaders of the Independence Party that the suggestion wasn't even put to a vote. Instead, the assembly proceeded to unanimously elect Christian Frederick, King of Norway. Ancient Norway had been resurrected. The rosy morning of the new golden age was at the horizon. People were emotional. Some wept openly. On May 20th, the Eidsvoll men met for the last time. Wedel Jarlsberg and Löwenskiold didn't attend though. They were too bitter about the way they and the Union Party had been treated. It wasn't that they didn't want an independent Norway, but they realized that Norway couldn't stand up to Sweden, so they wanted the next best thing. But instead of getting recognition for their realistic point of view, they had been attacked, heckled, and threatened. Despite that, or perhaps thanks to the absence of the leading members of the Union Party, the mood at the last session of the Assembly was one of unity and fraternity. In the afternoon, as the very last act, Jens Shrove Fabricius asked all members to stand up and proclaim, "United and faithful until Mount Dovre falls," appropriately cheered by the assertion of unity and loyalty to the cause of Norwegian independence. As long as the current geological situation remained stable, the assembly was dissolved. The members went back home again, feeling good about themselves. They had made history, written a constitution, and revived the ancient kingdom of Norway. But at the same time, the Crown Prince of Sweden, Carl Johan Bernadotte, was busy planning his countermove. Tune in next time to find out what happened. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. And if you've abandoned it in favor of Blue Sky, you can find me there as well. I look forward to hearing from you.